Hello and welcome to Books Corner on StratNews Global. I'm Surya Gangadharan and I have with me from Kathmandu Amish Raj Mulmi. He's the author of Odd Roads Lead North. It's the first definitive account from a Nepali journalist and writer on Nepal's relations with Tibet and China. It's a must read for all of you who are interested in Nepal, and it has a very contemporary flavor. There's a mix of history also in it. It's got a lot of personal anecdotes, so it's a great read. Amish, congratulations.
Thank you, Surya. Thank you, Surya, for having me over and for your kind words about my book. I'm quite pleased to be
Uh,
here with StratNews Global. Uh,
Great. Let's start off right away. How did you get the idea for a book of this kind?
it's there were multiple factors, but I think one of the core ideas that came up to me was a few months after the earthquake, the 2015 earthquake, when I had come back to Kathmandu and we were all eating. We were a group of friends. We were all eating in a Chinese restaurant in Tamil in Kathmandu's tourist district. And at that time, we started realizing that there was a sort of a spatial change that was happening in Tamil, where new Chinese businesses were coming up, new Chinese hotels were coming up, new Chinese restaurants were coming up, and the number of Chinese tourists was also increasing. It's about a year or so after the earthquake, if I remember correctly. And the question all of us had was, how did this come about? And no one really knew the answer to that. We knew that yes, Nepal and China had become close recently. There were leaders had begun visiting each other more frequently, but we didn't know how all of these spatial changes, these changes on the ground, could be seen so rapidly, and no one really knew how that happened. And at the same time, as part of my interest in Nepali history, I had been reading a lot into Nepal's history with Tibet and about trans-Himalayan trade, about how traders from this part of Nepal went and lived in Tibet for years at a stretch. So all of these came together in a sort of a narrative that was forming in my head about Nepal's history with Tibet and China. And of course, the contemporary part of it is very, very important. But equally important to me was the historical side of things, about how we came to be, let's say, how as neighbors, Nepal and China and Tibet were. And then after 1950, when China became our immediate neighbor, what was the status of relations between the two countries? So that is how the book came about.
So, where did you go for your sources? Were they in Nepal? Did you have to travel out?
No, so majority, as I say in the introduction, a majority of the primary sources, the textual sources were acquired off the internet. I looked at the Wilson Center. I looked at CIA's declassified papers. I looked at Jawaharlal Nehru's selected works. Then I also went to the Nehru Library in Delhi, the Martin Chaudhary Library here in Kathmandu. As for my primary travels, I started from Humla in the far west of Nepal. I traveled there in September 2018. Then I traveled to Mustang in April 2019, in Raswa at the same time. I was traveling and while I was coming here. So obviously in Kathmandu, I was doing a lot of research. Then in Pokhara and outside Pokhara, where a Tibetan camp is, I conducted research there as well. So overall, the book took me about 3 years to complete. So if you can say so, much of it, I mean, the pandemic hit us while I was at the last stages of the book, so I couldn't visit the Tatapani border, which I would have liked to do. I couldn't even visit China or Tibet, which was another sort of primary goal of mine while I started writing the book. But the pandemic hit, so those plans had to be cut down, and so I sat down during the lockdown, and that's when I wrote it.
It's amazing how in your book you recount the history of the defeat of the army sent by the Qing emperor, by the Gurkhas. I mean, great reading. And you also mentioned the linkages that the Newar community had with Tibet. It kind of reminded me of the roti-beti ka rishta we talk of India and vis-a-vis Nepal. Is this something? I mean, I know comparisons are odious, but is this something roughly similar?
I think it's as much more than similar. I think it just points to the whole interconnectedness of this entire Himalayan civilization and the people who live here. I mean, you look at the Newar traders. Some of them, till the introduction of the railways in British India, and then after till the time Young Husband opened the Sikkim route, Nepali traders would go via Kathmandu and then via the Nepali trading passes of Kuti and Kerung. But after Sikkim was opened up and railways started in India, Newar traders would leave Kathmandu, come down to Amlekganj, Raxaul, cross over into Raxaul, go to Calcutta, where they would have their own outlets, like what they call branch offices of today, and they would purchase items that they would sell in Tibet. So from Calcutta, they would go up to Kalimpong, where they would have another office. From Kalimpong, then they would load up their caravans, cross the border, cross Nathula, and go across in via Fari, via Yatung into Lhasa. So this sort of interconnectedness, I think it's very common. It was very common in the Himalayas till about 1950s, 1960s, when the Himalayas itself became a more securitized space because of the India-China war and the Tibetan issue that confronted the Chinese. So I think the roti-beti relationship is similar in nature in showing these interconnections between the many peoples and civilizations of this part of our world. And that to me is so fascinating because it throws up such interesting ideas, because there was one particular historian a British historian writing in 1928 that today a Nepali trader finds it easier to travel inside his own country by going down to India, taking the railway networks of India, and then alighting at another port or station that is closer to the destination that person wants to travel to. So even because there was so little road networks within Nepal, Nepali traders, Nepali travelers were using Indian transportation networks to travel to places within their own countries. And that sort of interconnection is just fascinating. So,
And I think, and I presume that with Tibet under Chinese occupation, things began to change. Would you
yes,
say
yes.
those ease of movement across Tibet has kind of ceased, or is it restricted?
Of course, I mean, what we saw was that what I found was that after 1950, for a few years, China actually wanted to come to terms with what exactly was happening in Tibet in terms of the trade, in terms of the extraterritorial arrangements that Nepali traders had in Tibet, and it first abrogated all such relationships. One of the first items in the Nepal-China treaty, as it was in the China-India treaty, was that all previous treaties were to be superseded by this particular treaty, which meant that Nepali traders enjoyed extraterritorial rights in Tibet, and that was obviously cancelled.
Yeah.
What China's arrival did in Tibet was to sort of make trade more formal, or rather make trade more responsive to modern state sovereignty factors. Like traders now require passports to travel, and Nepali traders did not really require a passport to go across to Tibet at that time, and so with situation obviously, and then there was also the Chinese insistence to use Chinese banks to send money home. Till then, Nepali traders were seen to be using British banks or British Indian banks, and that's all hundi, obviously. And it's sort of it felt like it seems as if China wanted to bring in this trade into a formal structure, and perhaps if the India-China war hadn't happened, if the Tibetan uprising hadn't happened, perhaps we could have seen an alternative, a more formalized alternative emerge to this trans-Himalayan trade. But sadly, that was not to be. So,
In fact, on the subject of China, frankly, I found your chapter titled Between Two Boulders, frankly, the most interesting because it has that Indian flavor in it. And it says here that it was Prime Minister Nehru who they encouraged, persuaded, or whatever, the then Nepali leaders to go along with the Indian policy on China. That's that's
Hmm.
quite ironical, isn't it? I mean, when you
No,
look at it.
that's one of the. I mean, it's an interesting when you obviously with history you always have the advantage of retrospect, no? Like
Yeah.
Nepali leaders at that time, they obviously Nehru had guided the Delhi Agreement that brought the Nepali Congress into power, and at that time, obviously, the 1950 treaty had been signed, which argued that Nepal's foreign and defense relations had to be closely coordinated with India. Nehru had also insisted on that. So obviously, there was a certain standing of Nehru among the Nepali people, Nepali leaders' minds. And Nehru has, if we have to remember that Nehru had been one of the first global leaders to push for a communist China's inclusion in the United Nations, to be
Yeah. Yeah.
recognized as a state, as a state, as counter to so it was that sort of conviction. And there is a particular quote by him where he says that given now things are, the situation in Tibet cannot be the same, after the arrival of the Chinese or something like that. And I think it was this sort of uh, waking up to reality. Like, what Nehru knew the reality was that China had come to occupy or annex Tibet. And in the face of this new situation, the communists had taken over China. In the face of this new situation, it was much better for countries like India, Nepal to have relations with China rather than to leave
Mm.
China, to have an angry China or a disgruntled China on the northern border. A
It was
friendlier
practical.
China would have been, yeah, it was a practical solution. And I think that's the interesting thing, that yes, obviously we see that Nehru's encouragement played a part in Nepali leaders reaching out to China, or China itself reaching out to Chinese leaders, reaching out to Nepali leaders. But over again, as the India China conflict became more intense, that China then started imagining, or rather putting in place its own South Asian policy that was counter to, let's say, Indian sort of ideas about what South Asia would be like. So
Would you say, how would you describe Nepal-China relations today? We have seen so much of Chinese diplomatic involvement in Nepal's internal
mm,
politics. So, how would you define that relationship today?
I think we're in an interesting place today with respect to China. What we've seen is that in the past decade or so, China has engaged in Nepal at a much deeper level than ever in the past. Now there are multiple reasons for this. Obviously, there's a push factor of the China's ambitions in South Asia, China's ambitions to counter Indian influence, as well as its own, let's say, global ambitions. That's the push factor. The other factor is obviously the pull factor, about Nepali leaders also looking towards China as a political and economic alternative to India, which is further intensified after the 2015 blockade. And it's today what we find is that China is confident enough in Nepal to be visible in its political negotiations, in its meetings with political leaders, something that it was never comfortable doing in the past. China is more visible in terms of what it wants out of Nepal. Like Nepal is regularly part of the Chinese, let's say, statements on COVID. On, let's say, we saw that with the joint announcement of Everest's new height. So these, obviously, Nepal is part of the Chinese narrative as well. So today the relationship has reached a sort of a comfortable level that was not seen in the past. Of course, the recent events, the split in the NCP, Prime Minister Oli's dissolution of the parliament, these have been sort of seen as setbacks for China in Nepal in terms of political influence. But at the same time, the economic influence of China remains. Just this morning, I was reading one news report that said that in 2020, of around FDI, all the FDI pledges in Nepal, China still led the way, but about 70% of the FDI pledges. And even during a COVID year, when FDI pledges declined about like 26% in Nepal, China's actually pledges rose by 1%, which is not a lot. But it's saying that, I mean, there is that sort of belief that, okay, Nepal can be a place for China to engage with economically, at least. So it's an interesting combination of political, let's say, a bit of political influence, a bit of economic influence, obviously strategic depth, as well as a gateway into South Asia. you know. So
Hmm.
obviously
It
the
went to
last
India
part of it
actually.
depends. Yeah, to India's northern markets. China has been very, very vocal about that. China has
Hmm.
indicated that the train from Tibet to Kathmandu intends to serve the to reach the Indian border. But with the recent, let's say, conflict in Galwan, I don't know how, like, there is a reset happening in India in how India looks at China. So
Yeah.
I don't know how possible that is. So
Do Nepali leaders know what they want from China? Is it? It's clearly something more than just a card to be used against India, although it's still used in that sense. But do they know what they are dealing with?
I I'm not sure about the. I would say it plays both ways. The thing is that China itself is not. There are case studies of how China itself is not sure of what Nepal really wants. I mean, it has in the past indicated for example, in the two mega hydropower projects of Budi Gandaki and West Seti, where Chinese companies, like three gorges, they were awarded the contracts. But I mean, these projects have not gone anywhere. So it seems that there is a sort of a lag between how China itself understands Nepal to work, or how Nepali politics, domestic politics interplay in these economic engagements. On the other side, what Nepalis want from China, well, the evidence points towards a sort of an aspirational idea that China can assist in infrastructure development, in economic development, in investments. And we've seen that in tourism, of how Nepali tourism has reoriented itself for the Chinese visitor. But whether whether Nepal is ready for the scale of Chinese investment, if it comes in even at, let's say, Sri Lankan levels or Bangladesh levels, I'm not so sure. We don't. We have not yet demonstrated an ability to negotiate deals, contracts, loans that are more favorable to our interests so far. I'm not saying that we have our debt. Let's say our debt to China matches, let's say, even Sri Lanka's levels or Bangladesh's levels. We are far away from that. But we still are not sure, for example, how we want to move ahead in terms of economic engagements. For example, let's take the train. Uh, we don't know whether the train will happen. We've admitted that we don't have the technical, let's say, expertise to do that. We know we don't have the money to invest in the train. So, but we still sort of, let's say, the narrative around the train continues. So if we don't know these factors, if everything on the train hinges on China's ability and its confidence in the Nepali market to, let's say, deliver, then then the negotiations should, let's say, point that way, right? Like, but right now it just seems like the train is sold as a dream, but there isn't anything concrete happening on it. So
Because I think Nepal is also part of China's BRI, and
yeah, yeah.
BRI budgets have been cut from what I've been reading. So it would appear
No,
that.
that is true. Yeah, the BRI budgets have been cut. I mean, since 2016, you've seen a downslide in loans. Obviously, Xi Jinping also said that all BRI investments have to be productive and not be a strain on the host country. But at the same time, I think the BRI itself is a very flexible program. The BRI, it can be termed as an umbrella, let's say, an umbrella program for Chinese state-backed investments in many countries. So in that sense, I mean, would you consider the Pokhara International Airport that is being from a Chinese loan by a Chinese contractor as part of BRI? It's not listed under the BRI, but it couldn't have happened without China's confidence in Nepal, which comes from the BRI as well. And similarly, with, let's say, these new irrigation projects that have happened in Nepal, and there's the Bhiri Babai multi-purpose irrigation project. It's not part of the BRI, but a Chinese company was a contractor. They delivered it well before time, and now the same company has got the contract for another irrigation project in the east. So whether, of course, the BRI also has reoriented itself to become more profitable, to become not give out that negative, let's say, narrative of the debt trap that the Hambantota port created. But in Nepal, what we are seeing is that Chinese investments are increasing. Chinese investments are rising. Yes, the COVID pandemic slowed them down, but this year, starting from the two projects that I just mentioned, the new irrigation projects in eastern Nepal, and there is another SEZ, a special economic zone in eastern Nepal in Prime Minister Oli's constituency, for which the construction has also begun. So we may not consider them as part of BRI, but these are signs that China may be willing to decouple, let's say, the economic investments in Nepal with its political influence. And that to me is equally fascinating.
Mention you took the name of Prime Minister Oli. Would you say this government of Mr. Oli is the friendliest that China has seen, or is there better to come?
Mm, I I am not so sure about whether we. I mean, if from one perspective, I don't think the Chinese expected the Nepal Communist Party to split, right? So whether it's the friendliest that Nepal has ever seen, I'm not so sure. I mean, during the monarchy, China was way more comfortable in Nepal. Of course,
Yeah.
China itself did not have the sort of ambitions in South Asia as it does now. But
Hmm.
I'm not so sure. I think the issue here is to assume that China understands how the Nepali domestic politics also functions, and it is cacophonous, it is partisan, and it is post 1990. We have seen multiple governments. It has been a sort of a recurring occurrence, and we had in not just China, and I think the entire Nepali population had expected that a government that had a majority, whether or not you agree with it, would last for 5 years. And
Mhm.
even with a majority, a government cannot last here. So that I think is the key to understanding whether I don't know. I can't say whether this is the friendliest government that China has ever seen. I mean, historically, as you've seen in the book, there have been friendlier governments under the kings, and under the two kings, there have been pretty friendly governments. But it seems that China may have erred by again putting all its eggs in one basket, as it earlier did with the monarchy, and
Yeah.
post-monarchy sort of reached out to the communists, believing the communists to be the biggest political force in Nepal. And they are. The communists are by and far the biggest political force. But whether it could sort of like envision, let's say, working with a stable government for over 5 years under the NCP, under the leadership of the Oli and NCP, of course, it erred in that. And now let's see, like, I mean, it's because the situation is so fluid, it's yet unknown what will happen next. So
Mhm. Are the Chinese reaching out to others in the communist? I mean, like Prachand, for instance. Is he somebody
no,
whom they see potential?
I am not, like, I wouldn't be able to tell you whether the Chinese are reaching out to other factions within the communists itself. I know. I mean, it has been post the dissolution and post the Supreme Court judgment on the NCP. The ambassador had visited a couple of leaders as well. So it seems that China is engaging with other political leaders as well in Nepal. I mean, of course, India is also doing that. Of course, like, I mean, the two neighbors have been doing that for a while now. So it's more about how visible in terms of the political influence these meetings are. you know it's and from as of this moment, or rather in the last month, what's being seen is this international, let's say, both China and Indian leaders or and envoys meeting Nepali leaders has really gone down. It's become more of a wait and see approach, where the contours of this this domestic impasse that Nepal has found itself in needs to be a way needs to be shown before these neighbors, let's say, come to a sort of a conclusion, or they conclude that, okay, this is the way forward for us. And I don't think that, like, for example, Nepali leaders themselves aren't sure what the next contours are going to be, whether we'll have a midterm election, whether we'll have a coalition government against Oli. We don't know. We don't even know yet whether there's a no confidence motion that's being tabled in parliament, despite the numbers suggesting that they are against Oli. So I think both the countries, most bilateral partners right now in Nepal, are taking a wait and see approach. So they're just trying to figure out. My sense is they're just trying to figure out how this interplay plays out. How this impasse plays out before arriving on, let's say, any course correction that they might do. So
Now, you alluded to this in your book, the ground level reaction to this Chinese involvement, shuttling between various political groups, the higher profile, which you've already mentioned in terms of investment and all. So, how is this being received by ordinary Nepalis? Do they feel threatened? Is there some resentment? Do they see shades of that India thing being played out again?
no, one of course. I mean, what it did was that it brought a new level of scrutiny on China that had never been seen before in Nepal. On these meetings, all these visits, and the Chinese ambassador was forced to confront them in an interview where they said that like non-intervention does not mean non-cooperation or something along those lines. And it basically, I mean, it was what she was implying was that like we are not intervening, we're just taking care of our interests, and which means that China has been very, very, in the last few years and across the world, China has been way more vocal, way more assertive about what it wants in terms of what its interests are. And that's not just in Nepal, that's across the world. What's happened, what's changed in Nepal in 2020 was that this visibility of meetings, like this sequence of meetings became more and more common. And they became part of this internal struggle within the NCP. So there were obviously, I mean, for example, let's say the faction that is against Oli will probably interpret these meetings in another way. The faction that is with Oli will interpret these meetings another way. The opposition interprets these meetings another way. The key question is that is China sort of replicating the same model that, let's say, Indian envoys used to follow in the past of meeting these political leaders? And if so, does it have the same level of understanding of Nepali politics that Indian envoys had in the past or even have today? I think that is the key. I am not so sure whether China understands the fractious nature of Nepali politics as well as, let's say, India does. And that has been a shortcoming. But at the same time, like I said, does it have the ability to step away from that political influence, from the political side of affairs, to focus on the more economic side of things, which obviously is more beneficial to it? Because the popular narrative, despite sort of raising questions at China's involvement in preserving the NCP, in helping Oli retain power, in allowing, let's say, Prachanda, Madhav Kumar Nepal, and Oli to sort of come to an agreement, and obviously the agreement came apart. Those are on one side, but the Chinese investments, the Chinese aid projects in Nepal, they are still visible to the Nepali public, and those haven't been scrutinized on a deeper level. Those are not scrutinized because it's clearly the political side of things that sort of scrutinized on a much deeper level, and that is new to China, obviously, in Nepal in 2020. So,
is there? I mean, the concern here is that China will slowly draw Nepal into its own strategic web. There are already some issues with the Trans-Himalayan arrangement the Chinese are working on. Is what? How do you see this?
no, of course, like any great power, I mean, any great power will like to have more countries in its fold. Like you said, like the way China has gone about it in Nepal that we have seen is China would like Nepal to join its narrative, which is essentially it believes that the Western narrative is not kind to it. So it runs a counter narrative on Everest. It does not call Everest, but it regards it as Jomolungma, and Nepal obviously calls it Sagarmatha. So the joint announcement of the hike was obviously one of those things. And there is the obvious, let's say, with any great power, that you would like countries to be within your sphere of influence. But whether Nepali leaders can retain Nepali interests while sort of, let's say, satisfying Chinese interests, that remains to be seen. What is key to me as a Nepali analyst and writer is that what are our Nepali interests? Have our Nepali interests been sort of like questioned? Have they been sort of listed? Do we know what we want from China? For that matter, do we know what we want from India? And until we are not able to satisfy that ourselves, we will continuously be pushed and pulled into this web of, let's say, great power rivalry. Do we want that? I mean, we profess non-alignment. We say that we want to maintain equidistance from both our neighbors as well as with other countries. But even if we maintain equidistance, how are our interests being taken care of?
Yeah.
And like I said in the book, I mean, there is increasing evidence that China has acted unilaterally on the border, especially during the pandemic, with its lockdowns, with its restriction of passage of goods across the border. So there is a sense that China is acting unilaterally on the border as well, and unilaterally on its interests as well. So where does that leave Nepal or Nepali interests? Nepal, recently, there was a report that said that Nepali traders were tired of this, the erratic sort of nature of the land border, the Raswagodi border, which is why they had started importing goods again via the sea, via Calcutta or Vishakhapatnam, that is. And that shows to me that despite all the bonhomie, despite all the, let's say, all the like the media celebrations about Nepal going closer to China, about that's the whole entire narrative that, like you said, that China is drawing Nepal into its web. The key question is, what is Nepal getting out of it?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
And
I mean, do
analysts
your analysts know what they're dealing with? China is
yeah,
not.
no, that's an interesting question. No, that like an analyst told me that from the outside it looks like China and Nepal have become really, really close friends, and Nepal has really benefited from Chinese presence, all of that. But it's only in Nepal that you know the nuances of it, which is that there are issues. Nepal has really not benefited that much, as even in comparison with other South Asian countries. I mean, leave aside Pakistan. The economic investments in Nepal, like Chinese investments in Nepal, do not match Sri Lanka or Bangladesh level. I mean, that is the sure fact. China does not see Nepal as with the same strategic value as, let's say, a Myanmar or let's say a Sri Lanka or even Bangladesh, right? So what is Nepal? How does Nepal matter to China? In many ways, it's a gateway, like we discussed. It's a gateway to northern Indian markets. But if the markets themselves are not open to Chinese companies or let's say Chinese products, then will China continue to be interested in Nepal? So these are questions that I think we need to have answers to. As Nepalis, more than Chinese, or let's say more than Indians or whoever comes, the key question is basically, what does Nepal want out of these engagements? How does it benefit us? If we are talking about infrastructure, what is the sort of payment structure? What is the loan terms? Are the loan terms favorable to us? And can we pay it back? And similarly with other let's say with this economic zone, this SEZ that's being planned in eastern Nepal, if Chinese factories are to come here to set up production, who are they producing for? Are they producing for the Nepali domestic market? Are they looking at exports? If they're looking at exports, are they looking at India or the larger South Asia? How do we do that? So these are questions we don't have answers to. So that's what, like I said, that we need to know what we are dealing with, and we need to know that in a much more detailed or a much more nuanced way than this current way of looking at China as an alternative to India. We need to engage with China on a much deeper level than just this basic understanding. So
last question, Amish, where do you see India in all this? Is it? I mean, in your book you mentioned that India seems to be enjoying China's discomfiture, and the frustration of having to deal with a very fractious political environment. Where do you see India, I mean, going forward?
No, in the last 5 or 6 years, one noticeable thing, at least in my view, is that there has been a shift in the way let's say Delhi has approached Kathmandu. Yeah. Whereas earlier, before the 2015 blockade, the focus used to be on the political side of things. After 2015, there has been a conscious push towards connectivity, towards infrastructure, towards driving the narrative towards that of India-China, let's say bilateral relation, towards connectivity, towards infrastructure, towards reconstruction after the earthquake. As I was telling you, that in the Amleganj petroleum pipeline was inaugurated, I believe, last 2018 or early 2019, sometime back. There's a second pipeline in the making from in eastern Nepal, coming from, I believe, from Siliguri to Kakarbitta. There is a Kathmandu Roxol train railway line that's been in the works, and it's moving ahead. And I think these instances show that India has obviously shifted its, let's say, narrative on Nepal from, let's say, the political side of things to the infrastructure, to the connectivity side of things, which is what India has traditionally been good at. India has
And which
traditionally
impacts
been
people's
good at.
lives. It has an impact
Of course, exactly. So there is this focus on people-to-people relationship. I mean, the whole point of connectivity is to show that we are, let's say, a shared civilization, and that is what these projects are doing. And in recent months, we saw that there has been some sort of an Indian position, a change in the Indian position in Nepal as well, which is particularly noticeable after Prime Minister Oli dissolved the parliament, when India said it was an internal affair, and it hoped that domestic processes, democratic processes would establish themselves. But at the same time, it was willing to do business with Prime Minister Oli's government by inviting the foreign minister over for foreign minister level talks in Delhi. So is India, let's say, stepping back from the politics, the political, let's say, influence, to focus on its long-term interests in South Asia, in the neighborhood, in Nepal? That will be true, but it's still too early to say that. What is for sure is that India has changed its focus to improve, let's say, connectivity, to focus on infrastructure, on reconstruction, on people-to-people relations. And that has obviously been more evident, let's say, in the last 5 or 6 years than before.
It's a great primer, and looking forward, Amish, to more interactions with you. And looking forward, of course, to your insights into Nepal politics, Nepal-China relations, and the way forward for this region. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Surya. Thank you, StratNews, for having me over. Lovely discussing this book with you and this general state of politics. Interesting times ahead in South Asia, for sure. Thank you so much, Surya.
Absolutely. Welcome. I welcome.